My name is Mike. I am the pastor here at the church at Risen City. We're so glad that you would be here this morning. If this is your first time, sort of special welcome. Just so glad you would give us some of your morning to be part of what we are doing today. We do believe that this is a home for anyone. That we believe that the grace of God invites us and accepts us on our worst days, on our best days, no matter where we come from or where we've been going, no matter what we've been doing, that His offering to everyone is to come and receive and be led to a soul-changing relationship with Him. It's why we exist as a church. And so we're just so pumped to be able to create a moment where that actually happens. Right? We want to be a church that's not necessarily about the religious rituals and services and things like that, but more about creating moments for people to truly encounter the God of heaven and earth, that their life changed by His grace, that we exist today in this moment to create a moment for someone else to truly have their life changed. We believe that it is possible. Right? This might seem crazy, but we believe it's possible to walk into church on a Sunday morning and leave forever different. That the grace of God can do something amazing in us today. So we're so glad to be here doing that this morning. It's the reason that we exist as a church even, to lead people into a soul-changing relationship with Jesus, because we know that that's what our souls truly need. The depths of a love of God in us and through us. For we believe that He is the source of our greatest healing and wholeness and joy and peace. It's all found in Him, no matter what season we're in, whether it's the best one or the worst one. We just believe that God and deepening our relationship with Him is what we actually desire truly in our souls. And so one of the ways that we do that here at Risen City is by we open the Word of God and we read the Bible. We do believe that the Word of God is a good Word. It's not some old, antiquated book that needs updates and revisions to make it relevant or palatable. We believe it's as good as it's ever been and that we still need the truth and grace that's in it. So we're going to open it up. Let's change us and challenge us and convict us today. And if you've been tracking with us for the last few weeks, we are in the middle of a series called Vapour. There it is, right? Beautiful graphic behind us, designed by my sister-in-law, Beth Foster. She does good work. Thanks, Beth. Anyways, here we are. And the series is about the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, if you're familiar with the Bible, the book of Ecclesiastes is found in what we call the Old Testament. It's part of the Bible that chronicles the history of the people of Israel and all that their ups and downs and all their sort of morality and immorality and confusing times and good times and bad times, how God sort of displays Himself through their history as always faithful, never present, in the God of covenantal promise and grace. And within that canon, we have this section called the wisdom literature that deals with how to sort of live life on this earth, that under heaven we see God set up the world in certain ways, and how do we figure out how to live within that framework. And Ecclesiastes is within that book. It's quite a different book. It's confusing. There are things that Cole, that he's sort of the main voice in it, that says are just flat out wrong, that we would say we don't actually agree with, but it's a philosophical faith kind of journey. So we're in week 4 of it already. So if you have a Bible, we're going to be in Ecclesiastes starting in chapter 3, verse 16. So if you want to turn there, if you don't have a Bible at all, and you would like one, we would love to get you one, but it will be on the screen behind me that we can follow along together. Before we do that, I just want to say a special quick announcement. Last week, if you were here, it was our Move to Mission offering. It was an offering that was dedicated to help us take a few steps forward in 2018, to give back into our city, to seed some money into church planting, things like that. And so I just want to say thank you, because over and above our normal offerings, we got in $3,200 to go into that. So thank you so much. That was a weak clap, but okay, for doing that. And we are going to take some of that money and put it and invest it as soon as we can into some different areas. And so we're so excited about that. So thank you so much from me to you guys. All right, chapter 3, starting in verse 16. This is what we read. Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness. In the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there's a time for every matter and for every work. I said in my heart with regard to the children of man, that God is testing them, that they might see that they themselves are but beasts, which, by the way, we disagree with. We believe that we are a special creation of God, the imago Dei, the image bearers of God, separate from the rest of creation. So already we see Cole making some false conclusions here. Verse 19, for what happens to the children of man, what happens to the beast is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. It's true, we all die. Welcome to church. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beast, for all is vanity, or this is the word havel, or vapor. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and to the dust all return. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth? By the way, we do believe that we know what happens, right? It's called heaven, that there's redemption that we're awaiting. So again, Colette is a little bit wrong. Here we go. So I saw that there is nothing better than what that man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? In chapter 4, again, I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of the oppressor there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. And I thought the dead who are already dead more fortunate than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been and has not yet seen the evil deeds that have been done under the sun. So, as a kid, I loved to eat. I love to eat. In fact, I still love to eat anything really. Bread, cheese, pasta, fruits, veggies every so often, right? But I make a really good Italian. I can eat bread and cheese and pasta all day, every day if I could. But that would not be good for the body. It's not healthy, so do that. And it's funny because even as Emily and I, we were on a date the other day, and we were trying to plan out next date ideas, and everything we came up with somehow always surrounded food. Whether it's going out to eat or dessert or coffee or tasting something, going something, it was always about food. We just love eating. Anyone else with me on that? We just love eating, right? It's just a good thing to do. Thank you, God, for food, right? But think about it, as a kid growing up, right? I had 4 brothers or 3 brothers, so there was 4 of us in the house, and we all loved eating, right? We all liked it. And so when it came to the dinner time, and when food had to be portioned out, you can imagine there was somewhat of a competition involved, and that everyone, at least from our perspective, had the same amount. When it came to splitting up, the chicken, right? If his piece looked a little bit bigger than mine, I made sure my mom knew about it, that I get more chicken next time. Or if the cake that was being split up, right? If his piece was just a little bit bigger than my piece, I would cry out injustice. It should be the same amount of cake. You know what I'm saying? Anyone feel that way? Anyone have that when you were growing up, right? And especially when it was that McCain's chocolate cake. You know what I'm saying? I don't even know if they still have that, and I'm pretty sure it wasn't even real food, but it was just really good cake, right? And my mom and dad got wise enough eventually to try to keep us a little bit honest, where they would make one of the brothers cut and the other ones choose to try to make it as even as possible. But then what that did is backfire, because then you just set your brother up, because you would intentionally cut it too big, and then when they take it, call them greedy and selfish, and you look like the bigger one, right? It didn't really work. But the point was that as these little kids, right, as silly as this cake is, right, we would have this thought that if I don't have the same amount, or if I didn't get what I thought I deserved, I would cry out, unfair. Mom, it's not fair, right? I should have got more than that. And it's such a silly little example, but this innate feeling that this is not right, when we extend that out to the whole universe, we actually feel that all the time. Where when we look at it on things like injustice, like evil and suffering, we say, God, this doesn't seem fair. This doesn't seem right. Maybe this is not the way it was meant to be. And Colette today looks out and he sees injustice, he sees evil, he sees oppression, and he's questioning, what is going on here? This doesn't feel quite right. This doesn't seem like this was how it's meant to be. Don't know if you've ever asked that similar question before. Don't know if you've ever thought that before, that maybe this world isn't the way it was meant to be. And so just to track everyone together here, Colette, he is the main voice, and he's been on a journey. He's been going for the last little while on this crisis of faith, you could call it. The way that he was raised to understand God and theology in the world, and then what he's been experiencing in life and sort of observing aren't fully coming together the way he expected. And so he's in this sort of crisis of faith moment where he's asking some questions, trying to figure out the answer to what he says is the meaning of life, or the point of life. What is the point of all our toil and work and labor under the sun, he says. And by the way, what we've been saying is that the crisis or the question, this isn't a bad thing. In fact, faith is not absent of questions. I would even go so far to say it's actually full of them. That our faith is one that seeks understanding, that we want to bring our mind to bear in our faith, to seek to understand all that we can. What we said about Colette was that his perspective was wrong. It was the way he was going about discovering all these things, because he has gone into what we've been calling for the last few weeks functional atheism. That I'm going to pretend like God really doesn't affect my Monday morning. I'll go to church on Sunday, I'll sing some songs, I'll pray some prayers, but then I go back to real life and sort of go about my way, not let God influence the way I think or decide or act. And in this case, he puts himself at the center of the universe as the sole authority in all that is right, true, and good. That his reason, his capability to understand, his understandings of the world, his experiences, that these things, his feelings are what define what is true, good, and right, and even brings God under his own judgment at times. Because if he's at the center of the universe, then God has to answer to him. And from this place, from this perspective, he makes this grand conclusion called Havel, or vapor, that the meaning of life is enigmatic, it's mysterious, it's chasing wind, it's there, but I can't quite grasp it. It's almost as if God's playing a trick on us humans, that there is this existence and meaning, but we'll never be able to attain it. And as we've been saying the past few weeks, we believe this is wrong, that God has made the world with purpose and reason, and we know what we are meant to live for, to be in a relationship with him, to bring about his kingdom, to be people who bring peace. And so we're going to look into a little bit more of that today, but what we begin to see is Colette here, for the last little while, he's been simply sort of self-focused, right? He's been covering things like legacy and death and the seasons of his own life. He even went to pleasure and just consuming all the goods that he could feel good about. But today he switches his view a little bit and begins looking outward beyond himself, and he says that where I expected to see justice happening, where I expected to see righteousness and goodness existing, I'm seeing wickedness or injustice. Where I expected there to be a place of rightness, I see a bunch of wrong things going on. He says, I see oppression. I see power being abused. I see people in tears and no one to comfort them. I see exploitation all around it. He has this sort of question like this probably isn't right, but what's the point of it all? And I don't know about you, but I think we've asked the same question before. Like, we have ample examples in our modern world, right, of injustice, of evil that is going on. Right? We can think of shootings and terrorism and exploitation and slavery and trafficking and corrupt governments, and we could go down the list and just open up the newspaper and see all the reasons to believe that this world is broken and not quite right. But Colette looks at that and he says, there's got to be something wrong here, but he even goes so far to say, but we're all just going to die in the end anyway, so why even bother? Which we would reject, by the way, right? That we don't really like that perspective. And what we have to begin to see today is that Colette's questions are not just simple observations. They're actually quite complex because they speak to the idea of God and evil in general, and in specifically here today with the idea of injustice and how we are to deal with that. That ultimately, I want you to understand this, that we are not the ones who simply bemoan injustice, but fight it. And we're going to go through that a little bit today. So these questions, they are actually very logical and rational and philosophical, right? Because we have to sort of wrestle with the idea that this good and loving and perfect and just and all-knowing God could allow evil to exist in his universe, and that's not contradictory in any sense. But then it's also very deeply personal, because we can try to reason this all out, but we've felt the pain of injustice, have we not? It's not like we can just reason this away. It's something that we have personally wrestled with. I've seen the tragedy. I've seen the abuses. You've walked through some of the personal pain and think that maybe I can explain it in my mind, but my heart still weeps. Because try to tell someone who's just on the other side of evil that God might have a reason for this. It's not really sensitive. It doesn't really help in that moment. So this is logical, it's personal, but also I want you to understand this, it's also costly for us. Because as we move through today, it's going to demand some activity from us. That we can't fully look at this without them being moved to do something about it. And so today we begin with this idea of evil and God. And usually this is what's thrown up from a skeptic, from a person who's wrestling with faith about why they don't believe in God. Right? They'll say something like this, that if God is all-knowing and all-powerful and he's all good or loving, then how could that God ever allow evil to exist in the same space that he is in? That these things must be contradictory. These things can't be in the same space. And here's the thing, philosophically, right? Philosophically or rationally, there actually is coherent reasons to believe that God and evil can exist and not contradict each other. Right? For example, if it is logically possible, right, just logically possible that God, who is an all-knowing being, who sees the beginning and the end, who knows everything from A to Z, could have a morally sufficient reason to allow a present justice to bring about a present injustice or evil to bring about a greater good in the end, that would give him the ability to allow evil to exist in a moment, knowing that greater good's about to happen. Or what if by stopping this evil, it actually started a butterfly effect that caused more evil in the future? Well, we'll never know that because we're not omniscient. But if that is his definition, then we could reason that God might have really good reasons to allow momentary evil for the greater good. Because especially as Christians who understand that the greatest good of our heart is an eternal relationship with God, not necessarily my momentary happiness, then what I can begin to see is that if God could use a present evil to bring me to a place of eternal goodness, that might be better and outweigh the evil that I'm currently in. Or in a world like ours where freedom is valued, where we say that we are moral agents, that we have responsibility, that we do or do not as we choose to do, that if God could uphold free will, that allows for us then to always choose the negative option. That I can choose to disobey, that I can choose to be unjust, that I'm not a robot that's demanded to act certain ways or not. So even with these two examples that are two of a few others, we can see that there is a logical understanding that allows us to say God and evil aren't polar opposite, or aren't contradictory. In fact, one author's name is Mark Clark. He's a pastor and author of a book called The Problem of God. It just came out a few months ago. I've just finished reading it. It's amazing. If you have any questions about faith and apologetics and skeptical belief about God, I would highly recommend getting this book. He sums it up simply like this: God is still good if he allows evil in order to retain free will in the universe, or it allows a greater good in the future. Thus, the idea that God and evil existing together, though may be difficult for us to accept, which is true. Can we be real? Right? Because it's confusing why God sometimes could allow present evil. Right? Though it might be difficult for us to accept, the two are not actually incompatible. So what we begin to see is Cole that looks out and he sees this injustice and sees these evils. These things don't nullify the goodness of God in any way. Those are not contradictory facts. And I want to argue today that these actually lead us deeper into a knowledge of who God is. Why? Because I think there's something deeper here that Cole that needs to answer. And simply this: why does he care at all that there's injustice in the world? Why do you care at all that evil exists? Why do you care at all that exploitation is happening? Like if we are just some randomly evolved creatures that happen to have the language and the ability to think about morality, that we're just going to die in the end, we're just like animals, why do I care that someone I do not know just was exploited by someone in power? Why do I care? Why do I look at the world and cry out, this is wrong, this is broken, this is disjointed, if all I am is a creature whose sole bent is survival? But maybe I'm not. Maybe we're not just some random creation in the world. Maybe there's something deeper than that. So here's the thing, right? That no matter who you are, whether you're someone of different philosophy or different faith, right, or you have no faith at all, right, we all feel the same thing. That when I see injustice, when I see evil, we feel that this is not right. That this is not the way it was meant to be. That there's something disjointed here that I'm seeing that calls me to speak against it. That calls me to say that this is broken. But here's my question. Where does that come from? Right? Like generally speaking, you and I will say that someone in power, right, to abuse that is wrong. It's not a good thing. Generally speaking, we will say that greed is not an acceptable sort of framework. We will say things like rape is bad in all cases. That murdering innocent people is wrong. That exploiting poor people is wrong. We will say that. But why do we say that? Why do we think that there's something that we can measure right and wrong against if we are not given that from some other source? That there is a standard of justice that we weigh our moments against, right? By the way, justice being treating everyone as they ought to be treated, in our case as human beings, as image bearers of God with inherent dignity and love and worth and value. Why do we think we can look at the world and say that this is bad and this is wrong without a framework to define what that is? See, what we get in Christianity here today is that we do believe that there is this moral framework that guards the world, that when people call things evil, it truly is that. It's not saying that this is a preferential moment, that this is actually something that is wrong, that breaks the heart of God, that there is a moral organization to the world that allows us to look at injustice and say, this is broken. It's wrong. I know we don't like using wrong anymore in culture, but there are things that are wrong. And if it's true in this case of evil and injustice, by the way, Christians, it's true in all cases of all the things that God has set up for our morality, that He is the standard by which we weigh our activity in all things. Right? From our money and our family and our sexuality and our vacations and everything, that it comes under the moral framework of our God, that He is the authority from which we make these decisions. And when we begin to see this, with Colette, right, when he's calling out injustice, I don't think he's just saying it's confusing. I don't think he's just saying it's unpleasant. I think he's saying this is wrong. It's broken. And my question, and what we have to lead to us today, is that these kind of convictions, I believe, actually lead us to know the heart of God more than anything else. Why? How many of you ever heard of C.S. Lewis? Right? He's a guy who wrote Chronicles of Narnia. He wrote a lot of other things as well. Most people don't really know all the other essays that he wrote. But in one of them, he wrote this. And by the way, he was an atheist. Who turned Christian as he thought and discovered and reasoned things out, by the way. Right? It's not that just to apply your reason means you'll run from God. In his case, it was the opposite. And this is what he writes. My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing the universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of that show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying that it was nothing but a private idea, a preference of what I desired. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really and truly unjust, and not simply that it did not happen to please my fancies. I think there was probably a better word than fancies he could have used there. It's just like awkward to say out loud, right? It's one of those weird things. But this is what he's saying, right? He's saying that there has to be something deeper than my preferences to think that this is bad or undesirable that mean that this is wrong. That what I'm looking at is truly wrong. He says we get this idea from the justice of God Himself. It's transcending me. It's bigger than me. It's beyond my immediate. There's something that has to transcend culture and time and personal truths that speak in all cases, in all times. So that when I call this unjust, I'm not just saying I don't like it, but it's truly unjust. And this is where something like a naturalistic evolution falls apart. Because if we are simply just evolved animals that do everything we can do to survive, then everything that I have in my framework of existence is simply to survive the next generation, not necessarily to find what is true. Not necessarily to have truth be my God. And so therefore, right, what happens is that morality simply becomes that which was adaptive to survive, which might change as generations come. In this moment, it may have been unjust to do these actions, but because it helps me survive now, then it's also unjust that the ones who are the strong, their opinion define what is right, and that means it just falls into a relative morality. That means in one moment I could cry justice, but the next one I couldn't, which simply derives my preference for a moment. That because I don't like this, I call it wrong. But I don't know about you, but I would never want to believe that sometime rape will be okay. I don't want to believe that sometime in the future, if things change, that somehow murder is all of a sudden okay. I don't think it's actually compatible with how we are made to believe that in the future, exploiting the poor might be a good thing to do. Because there's something that grounds us, a moral framework, a justice that drives us, an objective. And so we cry out like Colette does because we know this is not how it's supposed to be. That the world is truly broken. The world is not functioning as God intended it to be. And so we cry out, God, will you end this? Will you fix it? Will this stop eventually? And as Christians, what we have access to is a genuine hope in the face of evil. Why? Because unlike sort of a New Age philosophy that takes some of its ideas from sort of Eastern religion that says that suffering and evil and injustice are just Maya, just illusion, not actually real. Just escape it. That's what enlightenment is, not letting it affect you. Stare into the eyes of a 13-year-old girl being trafficked and tell her it's an illusion. And see how powerful that is. Right? We say, no, this is real. This is an issue. This is an actual evil that we are called to fight. And unlike sort of karmic religion that says you actually deserve the suffering that you are in, so why complain about it? That you don't get to say this is wrong if karma's just weighing everything out and making it all balance. So you did something bad in your past life or you're just being paid back now. So you can't actually cry out injustice because you deserve this. And we say, no, Jesus actually talked against that in his Gospels. So there is unfairness in the world. There is senseless evil that goes on. And unlike atheism or secularism that says life is inherently meaningless and we have to create our own, so therefore in and of itself our suffering is nothing, we say no, it's actually quite meaningful. Because we have a God who works in spite of it. And a God who will bring justice to all evil in the world. That there is an end to evil. There is a hope for redemption that we understand as Christians. That we have the justice of God. We have the judge who is our God. And we have the framework to truly call rape and murder and exploitation and evil, evil. And fight it. This is what we have to sort of move ourselves to today. And what we begin to see, right, is Colette here. He is saying that there is real oppression, there is real injustice, there is real wrong happening. Not that this is undesirable, but wrong. That this is not how it's meant to be. But he concludes, right, that it's just Havel. It's just vapor. It's just chasing after the wind because he says we're all just going to die anyway, so why even bother ultimately caring? And we would say, no, Colette, you're missing something. Because in Jesus, what we get access to is a God who not only cares deeply about our present suffering, but a God who seeks to eradicate it, a God who seeks to redeem it, and a God who's present with us in it and leads us to our hope. Right? Because I don't know if you know the story of Joseph, but he was a youngest brother of 12, and he was sold into slavery. He went into Egypt, raised through the ranks, and became a ruler in Egypt. And when his brothers come back to him, he says this, "What you meant for evil, God has now meant for good." That God had a good reason to let that suffering happen, to let that evil happen, because now it meant your life gets saved through mine. As Romans 8 says, that our God uses all things, good, bad, and evil things, ultimately for our good. Now that promise is deeply confusing. Can we be real? We quote it all the time because it makes us feel good. But it's hard to fully understand that. It's not just some emotional crutch that we lean on as Christians. I believe this is sort of an existential reality, that our hope is bigger than suffering, that evil is not the final word in our world, that there is something, a good that God's moving us towards, that we can forever hope and bank on. This promise is sure that He will lead us out of this present evil. And so we wait on Him. So we wait for this God. As we talked about last week, if you were here, that sometimes the hardest seasons of our life are the ones that produce greatest growth in us. That sometimes it's the most painful times that God actually works deepest in. Because, as I said earlier, for you and I as Christians today, what do we believe is the greatest good of our life? To be in an eternal relationship with Jesus, not momentary happiness, not momentary comfort. And that if God could lead us to a place where we receive the deepening, eternal good of knowing Him, He might be able to redeem present moments of my suffering and my evil, my pain. Now, before we continue on, we have to deal with something because in this conversation, right, around evil and injustice, there's something we don't often deal well with enough. And I know today has been a little more, somber than normal. If you're used to Risen City, I'm usually way more hilarious. At least that's what I tell myself after Sunday mornings. But today we do need to deal with some of this heavy stuff. Some of this hard knowledge from God. Because here's the thing. Evil and injustice can be reduced to one word, sin. And here's the thing. It starts with you and I. We so easily like to cast it off into some other external world. It's the terrorists' fault over there. They're the real evil ones. Right? It's that country. It's those people. If my parents raised me better, I would act this way. If my wife wasn't the way she was, I would be a better husband. If someone was different, if the circumstances changed, then I would be a better person. It's always somebody else. But the problem is Jesus. Christianity forces us to take a step back and realize that I am not simply just a recipient of injustice, but a contributor of it. That I am actually part of the problem. And until I can own that, and own that there's maybe something in me that needs to be fixed and redeemed, I'll never make the steps to see that happen. Because I am truly part of the problem. See, the story that we tell as Christians is that God made the world good. He called it very good. And then when we rebelled, when we sinned, the fault of man is that we said, God, you know what? I think I'm going to go be a functional atheist right now. I don't really need you. I think there's better outside of you. I'm going to go try to do this all by myself. And we ran from God. And in that moment, the fall of man in Genesis 3, it says that sin entered into the world, that brokenness and chaos and evil and selfishness and pride and shame filled what God had made good and broke it. So what that means now is you and I, as we live every day in this sin, we perpetuate that chaos. We perpetuate that injustice, that truly for us, we have to understand that evil hides in the pride of our heart. Right? That injustice sits underneath the selfishness in our soul. That oppression is on the other side of the greed that I allow to live inside of me. But luckily for us, and here's the joy of our heart, that's not the end of the story. It's not like God just ended it right there and said, well, now everyone's just going to go off and be forever broken. No, He said, I'm going to come and fix it. The hope of the story of God is that this Bible that we have is a story of God both hating evil, but also redeeming those who are. That He is with us and fighting for us. That He is the one who will overturn every single wickedness for the greatest possible good to come. And this is where we begin to see the narrative switch for us today, because this is no longer about specific generic evil, but Colette cries out against specific justice. He looks at his people, he looks at his city, and he says, there's wrong things happening here. There's oppression and exploitation. There's injustice in my city when I thought there would be righteousness. God, why is this happening? And we have to begin to understand that the promise of God speaks not simply just to the generic sort of philosophical problem of evil, but also the specific injustice in our world. That we know that His promise is to fix what you and I have made broke. And what we begin to see is the whole Bible becomes this story, becomes this narrative of God Himself working the redemption and for the eradication of all evil. But hear me, this is the key thing, and calls His people to be part of the solution. That ultimately you have a role to play in this. That we don't just get to cry out injustice and do nothing about it. See, this is the thing about God, is not only is He saying that evil and injustice, these things are wrong. He goes one step further. I don't know if you've ever noticed this about the Old Testament, but God continually identifies Himself with the vulnerable. That He's the God of the widow and the orphan, the father to the fatherless. That He hears the case of the widow, that if you mock the man who is poor, you mock His Creator. That God consistently, not to the powerful, not to the prestigious, not to the prosperous, but to the weak, identifies with and calls us to do the same. Right? Here's the thing, right? God so deeply cares about this issue of justice and evil in our world that he will do stuff for it. But as I said, calls you and I, the ones who bear his name, who say that we are his, to be about it, that we are light bringers who push back the darkness, that we take up the cause of the voiceless, that we become the people who bring peace and shalom and righteousness back on the earth. In fact, if you track through the Old Testament and God coming to judge his people, two big things happen. Usually, he judges them because of what's called idolatry, that they have rejected him, that they've chosen a different God, they've run off to a different religion and sort of made idols and temples and things like that. But then secondly, it's because they allowed injustice to exist in their ranks. That you track through it, God says, you've exploited people. You've not treated them as my image bearers. You've allowed the poor to be oppressed. You have done what I call evil, and so I must come and discipline. And one of the most scary verses in all of Scripture is Isaiah 58, where God, he has his people there, and they're praising God and singing and fasting and worshiping and asking God, why aren't you hearing our prayer, God? Why aren't you receiving our worship, God? Do not take notice of what we are doing, and listen to his response. Is this not the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice, to untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free, and to break every chain? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and provide for the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and to turn away not from your own flesh and blood? Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will shine about you. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will hear. He will hear the cry for help, and he will say, here I am. He says, you're praying, you're calling, and I'm disciplining you with my silence because you do not do what I call right. And you allow what I call evil to exist amongst you. That you do not work for the releasing of the oppressed, the breaking of injustice. That you don't work to feed the poor, to care for those who are oppressed and exploited. So if you don't do this, I will not hear you. Not because I don't love you, but because I'm disciplining you to know what I'm about. The grace of God never lets us run, but the discipline of God allows us to see what his heart is like. And even Jesus in the New Testament, when he's talking to the Pharisees, the ones who have all the answers and all the religious right and rules, he says, you've done all the right rules, guys, but you've forgotten what God matters about, what God cares about, pursuing justice and seeking mercy. He says you will exploit the poor widows and then you'll tithe off your cumin. That's not what I'm about. Right? What we have to see today is that we need to be a people who are about bringing the kingdom of God to bear, both physically and spiritually. That his kingdom is not just about salvation, but also righteousness. Right? Which, by the way, means being right with God and then right with people. That I have peace between me and God, which frees me up to have peace between you and I. That I seek to treat every image bearer of God as they deserve to be treated, and not be okay when they're not. That I'm about bringing the kingdom of God here, as James says, to have pure religion, which was what? Taking care of the widows and the orphans and abstaining from evil. So the question we have to ask ourselves today is are God's ears closed to ours? Prayer. Would he be disciplining us because we care not what he cares for? See, this is the thing, right? Like, as Christians, we are so good. We are so good at writing blog posts, right? And Instagramming our mission trips, right? And going to conferences all about justice. The question is, are we doing it? Is our city better because we are here? Or are we just another church on the corner that has a million churches in the city? Or are we actually doing something that makes this place better? Right? Are we taking up the cause of injustice to fight back the darkness? Are we doing what God's called us to do? Here's the thing as a church, right? This, Isaiah 58, it haunts me as your pastor in all the best ways, right? Because they were just a religious community worshiping God and doing the services and having all the church time. But God's like, I'm not listening to you. I don't want our church to ever be in this space where God would look at us and say, I can't hear you right now because you don't care what I care about. That's why our move to mission, we're taking 10% and just giving it away to the good of our city. It's why we're trying to challenge our Connect Group leaders to start doing service projects as a part of the Connect Group routine. It's why we're making sure our Good Works department is up and running at full force in this next year so that God won't look at us and say, you don't care what I care about. This should haunt us as Christians, that we are called to be about His kingdom. And if we are not, His love for us will keep Him silent. And I pray that we would never be that church that gets so excited about a Sunday morning when we know that on Monday we do nothing. I pray we will never be in the space where we have a really amazing worship time and leave this place thinking that we've encountered heaven and it does nothing for our Tuesday afternoon. We have to be a people that make the difference. See, we are so good at praying, but we are often not good at being the answer to our prayer. Because instead of praying, God, feed the hungry, maybe God's saying, just go buy some bread. Instead of saying, God, fix it, He's saying, well, let's get started. Let's partner in this. We are called to be His agents, to be His kingdom workers, to be on mission with Him in this way. Because wherever the gospel went in history, if you traced it through, you go read through some church history, wherever the gospel got preached, wherever Jesus was proclaimed, the poor got taken care of. Vulnerable people got loved. The exploited were cared for. They got a voice when they had none. This is what happens when the gospel takes root. It should happen here as well. This is how our God operates. And you know, at the end of the day, Ben, you guys can come back up. We're going to be closing here. At the end of the day, it's in this space, in the justice of God, that we actually begin to see some of His love purely. So I want us to understand this, right? That the love of God demands that evil and injustice, it doesn't just go away. It doesn't just fade into existence. It doesn't just stop in some random space. The justice of God demands that evil ends before God as He judges it. See, something we don't like talking about much, but this is truth about who we are. That no thing that is unjust on the face of this earth will escape the justice of God. That no sin will be out of the grasp of our God. That no exploiter, that no abuser, that no wife beater, that no trafficker, that no traitor, that no greedy heart, that no corrupt government, nothing will escape the justice of our God. He will bring it to an end before Him. Because His love demands that. This is the crazy thing. His love demands that He eventually makes sure the world is rid of evil. His justice is demanded by His love. And when we try to make God some amoral, no standard kind of spiritual fairy up in the sky, we actually reduce Him down from the qualities we think we're elevating. Because if He's not a God that demands justice, He is no God at all. He's not good. If He allows evil to just have no end and have no answer, then He is not righteous. His love demands today. His goodness demands that He becomes the judge of the earth. I hope you understand that when that happens, you and I stand before Him as well. And this is why the gospel, the good news that Jesus is so good. This is why it's so wonderful, because when I couldn't be just enough, when I couldn't be good enough and perfect enough and sinless enough, Jesus was. Right? That's the whole testimony. That's not about me. That I'm empowered by the grace of God to do as He's called me, not in of myself. Right? This is our story, that this God of the universe, that He left heaven, came and lived on earth and subjected Himself to the very evil we decry. That He was unjustly tried. That He was murdered, exploited, abused, exposed on a cross. And from this great evil came the greatest good ever, our salvation. On the cross, we had our souls won back. Out of these ashes of injustice, life arose, because that's just how God operates. That He came and identified with the suffering and then defeated it. And for us, we need to understand That when we come to Jesus, we come banking on the fact that it is by faith in Him alone that I have life. And that through that life, I then become just to go and do likewise. That I'm called by this God to be exactly like Him. That on the cross, Paul writes that the one who knew no sin became sin so that you and I might be free, so that you and I might be just, that He's not just the justifier, but the one who makes us just. See, today we have a call. You have to care about justice in your city. You have to care about the poor and the vulnerable. You have to care about evil being done because we are God's people. That's why. We don't get to say, God, I'm just going to be apathetic today and I hope your grace is good. The grace of God forces me, leads me, compels me to love sacrificially. That I can't claim to say I have been raised to new life by the God of grace and then not love like He did. Today is a day where we need to understand that because of the grace of Jesus, because we trust in Him, that we have been justified before Him, made righteous in His eyes, but then made just. That we, unlike Colette, we don't just bemoan injustice. We work for its reversal. So the question is, what are you doing to fight the darkness? What are we doing to push back the evil? Evil and suffering and injustice in a person, these things, they are confusing. I get it. And they're real and they affect us and it's painful. We see it. But unlike Colette, we don't have to look at them and call it Vapour, call it Havel, lose faith and lose grace with God. No, we can look at it and know on the other side of it we will be better. That on the other side of it we can make a difference. That we can do something powerful in the grace of God. Seeing that we have a God who is called Emmanuel, present with us and Redeemer. That He is called with us in the moment and the one who leads us to our hope. That's who we are. That's who we need to be. So if you're here today and you're in the midst of evil and suffering, I know it can feel meaningless, but it's not. I know it can seem senseless, but it doesn't come out of the grasp of our good God, who Romans 8 says is going to lead it for your good. I can't tell you the whys of why things happen. I can't. I wish I could. I wish I had that kind of insight to let you know. But what I do know is that in it all, if God can bring you to the place of your eternal good, that is what He's doing. It's what He's doing. And may we rest today knowing that God will hold every evil accountable that's been done to us, every abuse that's been done to us, every injustice to us, He will hold accountable and none will escape His grasp. So let us put on the sword today. Forgive and let God deal with what is coming. This is our power. This is our hope. So today, because of Jesus, may we rejoice that justice is God's, that freedom is ours, and that grace gives us the power to bring about justice wherever we can. Christian in the room today, simple question. What are you doing? How are you fighting back the darkness? How are you loving like Jesus? As a husband, by the way, this even scares me more because there are two reasons why God says He will hinder your prayers. One, because you don't honor your wife. And two, because you don't love justice. So men in the room, you got to doubly own this. I don't want God to ever ignore my prayer. I thank Him that His grace is good. He never casts me aside, but I don't want His discipline to come against us. What are you doing to push back the darkness? If you're in the room today and you're not a Christian, and you're sort of exploring faith, hey, first of all, so glad that you're here. I know today was probably a little more somber than you expected, but sometimes the Bible gives us a hard word and we receive it with joy because we know it leads to our freedom. But here's the thing. Can I challenge you to think, challenge you to understand that injustice and evil actually don't make sense outside of Jesus? That it's Him and His framework that gives us the ability to cry truly that these are wrong and broken. And that the feeling that you have that the world is not quite right is because God has put that in you to know and to point you to Him. And do not walk out of this room knowing today the simple fact that you are too a contributor to it. We don't like hearing it, but it's true. But in the word, in the grace, in the love of Jesus, we have the just and the justifier. That He can make us like Him, that we can be forgiven, that we can have the call of the kingdom to live more than just for ourselves, to be empowered by His grace to go and live for the greatest cause, the kingdom of Jesus. I pray you would come to Him today. I pray you would.